All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Alex McMath. I'm a data privacy and security analyst here at CyberData Pros, and I'll be the host for the show here. For our first episode, we are covering cloud security best practices, and bringing in for that, I've got Corey Cienza.
Hey, everybody.
So we each kind of have our own specialty here at CyberData Pros we're trying to learn more about as time goes on. It's a big emphasis to why we're doing this podcast to begin with. It's to help people come to grips with whatever specialty they might be into. I'm sort of in for privacy. Corey, what brings you in for yours?
Yeah, so for me, I kind of like to play the field with some of the more technical sides, a little more of the networking, and very much more on cloud infrastructure and sort of like cloud elements, how they're built, how they're networked, how they can be developed to be just these massive, beautiful, intricate things. And to me, it's kind of like making a Swiss watch. It's always tiny, delicate little parts, but they all kind of work perfectly together. So cloud infrastructure is a really cool thing for me.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too that I don't particularly specialize with these more technical elements, but as I go on, I see more and more transitions to cloud, more emphasis on cloud this, cloud that. So just being in the tech field in general and hoping to learn about what our clients are doing to pick solutions out for them, I got to learn quite a bit about cloud stuff. And so it's always something I'm kind of more interested in hearing about and figuring, more things about. And I know one topic that, immediately comes to mind for me is, what are the best security principles for this time and day, right? When a client has a bare bones cloud environment, they want to know the first things they got to do to get some level of compliance or security with it.
Sure.
And I think that's a lot of what we're looking to cover today.
Yeah.
And to that end, I just wanted to start with a pretty, guiding in question for people who aren't too familiar with cloud security.
Sure.
Just to do a quick rundown. So, when we refer to cloud security, what exactly do we mean?
Okay. So I like that question. It's a very broad, very open question, but I definitely get it. I think there's some good points to cover the core of that. So in essence, I think it's best not to overcomplicate, at least from a baseline level, the differences between traditional infrastructure, traditional security versus cloud security. Now, there's definitely some really important things to consider when you're trying to build a secure cloud environment and its infrastructure. And I really think the biggest thing to consider is trying to understand that the core architecture and design of the environment itself is really the most important concept when you're developing the security. A lot of traditional like tech or computer security, you're thinking of real basic things like your access control, your authorization, your MFA, least privilege, zero trust, things like that, and all that stuff still applies to cloud. But seeing as cloud is such a malleable, fluid, constantly changing and growing thing, it's not a computer. You can't treat it like a computer. You can't say, I'm going to make sure these files over here are encrypted and that'll be fine. I'll make sure that this one person doesn't have access to this section. I'll just apply some updates over here. If you're treating your environment like a computer, you're definitely set up for failure. So the way I look at it is it's sort of like building on a glass foundation. Sure, you can get plenty of different places treating it, in that really ad hoc, piecemeal kind of way, but security in a cloud environment is very, very much based on its architecture, understanding what you're going to do in that environment, how it's going to be used, and making sure the very core concepts of how your access controls and your access management, your user privileging, all your application level privileging, your networking, all that has to be built from the start, kind of work together. Otherwise, you're kind of fighting a losing battle at that point.
I hear you. So it's, I've heard a lot in recent years about privacy by design. That's something I've always heard pushed. And it sounds like, and this is a case where we're kind of looking to have our rules and, a whole system for this kind of decided or planned from the get-go, right? I mean, would you say that's usually the best approach with something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. Just because your cloud environment itself isn't necessarily going to be hosting, government secrets or anything like that, doesn't mean you don't need to have still those really strict baseline level of, your really essential controls. Like I said, access, authorization, things like that. Because you got to remember, with cloud environment, it's not a computer. You're not giving somebody access to a system if you use a bad password. You're giving them access to the entire power of that cloud environment on your credit card, if you think about it. So
that's true.
One laptop being compromised can only get you what's on that laptop. Obviously, internet connected, there's more to it than that. But when you're talking about a compromised AWS account, for example, you're now giving that attacker, someone who's compromised that account, access to the entire suite of, potentially this is, of course, if we're talking about an improperly built environment here, you can give them potentially administrative access to that console in the entirety of AWS's suite of services and power, all on your credit card. So it's the risks and the challenges are a little bit different.
Yeah. I could see that being a pretty big disaster. I know one thing, I'd be concerned about, I see it kind of in privacy a lot, is you'll have someone who's been using an environment, be it a cloud environment, sometimes in privacy it'll be a database or a cookie system or something like that, right?
Sure.
And they'll have run it for a year or two, kind of informally. They're not doing anything too special with it for a while, but over time they start gathering more and more stuff, or maybe in the cloud environment they're doing more and more with it, and they get into a case where it's like, well, wow, we have to start taking this seriously, right? And the problem, at least with privacy, is, again, privacy by design. That's great if you've been doing that from the start, but so many people don't. So when we get into a case like that, if someone's got a cloud environment, they've been using it for a while and have some configurations on it, how would they go about, I guess, retrofitting security, or is that even a good option, you'd say, in some of these cases?
That's an interesting question. So there actually is a term in cloud computing for exactly what you're talking about, and that's called cloud sprawl. So the idea of starting your environment with, you got your little egg here in the middle that has all your core applications. Maybe you got some EC2 instances that some of your remote workers come into and use on a daily basis. But as you start adding little pieces here, branching off, things become less condensed and less compact. Things start spidering out, and the visibility gets worse and worse as you keep adding things on, band-aiding things on, interweaving all these random little things.
Yeah.
It gets really easy to just kind of lose track. We always, there's that famous phrase, it's only temporary if it doesn't work. Yeah. So, the cloud is a very good example of someone who may, put something in temporarily only to forget it was temporary. And then it's there and they can't see anymore. Things like excessive permissions is a huge example of that. Hey, X developer just needs, I need admin so I can make this one change. Okay, great. Grant those rights. What process do you have in place for taking those rights away? Well, you don't. 6 months later, you forget that developer still has admin rights. They use a weak password. There you go. So cloud sprawl is a very real issue. And man, how do you go about fixing that? Honestly, I think if you take the approach of, I think it requires fixing the problems and not the symptoms, if that makes sense. I think worried about trying to rein in all these little pieces one by one, or trying to fix access controls based on individual systems or networks, that's treating the symptom. Mm-hmm. So you're treating what the root problem has caused. I think treating the problem, which is that sprawl in and of itself, is a much, much bigger undertaking, but realistically is the only way to ensure that you're kind of fixing that problem. So that would entail sort of redeveloping, and again, as I mentioned before, rebuilding that foundation, that core little nest egg you've got in the center, to make sure all these things are, all these permissions, all these systems are working together properly. So it could come down to, rebuilding an environment in code, so infrastructure as code, where you can track permissions on a very like visual level, a very inherent level. So in general, I think just focusing on rebuilding that core and moving everything into that core idea under one roof is kind of the best way to go about that, rather than just, again, trying to put band-aids on the symptoms rather than the problem.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of a philosophy change too, going into a whole new environment, and oftentimes I think a lot can be learned from iterating, one system and recreating it. I know I've seen that come up a lot when I've heard about like technical debt and stuff like that, and software development. Mm-hmm. Same thing, you get band-aids on band-aids, and
iteration is a good way, what you're saying as well, and I think that ties a lot into that infrastructure as code concept, because that's another cool thing you can do with cloud that you can't do with on-premise servers. Is say, hey, you want to try to see how a system would work. You could stand it up in a matter of minutes, go, oh, that doesn't work great. Tear it down like it never existed. That doesn't really work in the physical world. You can't do that. So with infrastructure as code, you can have like a script, or these documents that are quite literally are just scripts that tell AWS or Azure how to build the environment exactly the way you want it. So with by uploading this one script, you can have 15, 20, hundreds of systems all come online with users and access controls and API keys and all this stuff all at once. Then you could observe that system, how it works, for however long you need to make sure it's effective, and go, okay, that's not working right, or I don't like this. Take it down. Change a couple lines of code, put it right back. So there's some really amazing stuff you can do using the infrastructure as code, or iterating on it like you're talking about.
Gotcha. So on the note of infrastructure as a service, actually, one thing I hear quite a bit from clients, and I kind of find myself figuring myself during audits, is how responsibilities get distributed when using cloud products. When we talk about who has ownership for what, who, if data has an issue, which neck to choke.
Sure.
And when you're using something, like Dropbox, for example, versus AWS servers, does that sort of responsibility change? How do we determine who owns what?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a super interesting example you used, and I love that example. It's a good one. So, in the situation of Dropbox, so say I'm just an end user, just a Joe Schmo, and I've got my files on Dropbox. Well, what's interesting about your question is Dropbox doesn't own their own physical servers. They don't own hardware where they're holding your data. They actually use AWS, which is interesting. So, in this case, Dropbox is the one that's responsible to me as a consumer. I'm giving them, they are a software as a service to me. So I'm giving them my files. They are responsible for the security of their platform, so of their software. The only thing I'm responsible for is like username and password, just access control. So I get to choose who I want to have access to those files and don't. Everything else from the consumer's perspective is responsibility of Dropbox. Now, what's interesting is if we take the perspective from Dropbox now. So Dropbox uses AWS as an infrastructure as a service. So what AWS is saying is, we will manage all of the hardware. You don't have to worry about hard drive space or CPU usage or amount of RAM or availability or elasticity. We have all that handled. We take care of that. What you have to manage is the actual application itself and the infrastructure, or the software infrastructure that software relies upon. So it is up to Dropbox to maintain the software, patch the systems that their service runs on. So, and I'm sure they don't use EC2 as a vanilla instance, but as an example,
sure.
They're running hosting applications on EC2. They'd be responsible for patching the OS patching the software, making sure things stay up to date, making sure access controls are correct. So they're so responsible for their environment and for their software. But minus that, AWS accepts everything sort of beneath that infrastructure layer. So you can see that the tiers kind of change. All that responsibility just kind of flows down into different chunks. So that in cloud computing, that's called the shared responsibility model, which is something that is, honestly, it's really, really cool. It's something you don't think about too much because it feels inherent in a sense where you say, okay, I gave Dropbox my files. They're responsible for it. Well, of course they are. It's their service. Like it makes sense from that perspective. And same thing for Dropbox to AWS. Dropbox says, hey, you're allowing me to build all of this. I can't control anything else. Of course, I can't be responsible for what I can't control. That makes sense. But, in the real world, it's actually pretty complicated and really interesting based on whether platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, all these different styles of these shared responsibility models. That responsibility can change and shift pretty drastically. And in the far end of that, there's examples, again, on AWS with a service like Lambda. Lambda is what's called a serverless compute instance. So you can have an application code, just a big block of code, paste it in the Lambda, set it up in your network, and it just runs. There's no OS to configure. There's no software updates. There's no nothing. For you, it is just throwing code into the ether and it just magically works. That means Amazon's comfortable with taking all the rest of those responsibilities away from you, saying, we'll handle all the rest of this, you just worry about yourself. Whatever your code's doing, that's all you got to take care of. So that responsibility model can shift pretty greatly from service to service, but it's ultimately just amazing the amount of flexibility you can get with that.
Yeah. And honestly, that's a good thought. I think a lot of times, sometimes people think that it can introduce new problems having less control over their own infrastructure, software, you name it. But in a lot of cases, I think there, probably are a lot of advantages unless you really need to be handling your own security down to a granular level. I mean, is there much an advantage, you think, to hosting on-premise solutions for many companies beyond having something like Amazon who's got their stuff locked down tight?
Yeah, so this is one of those debates it's gone on for years. It'll continue for years later. But I think in general, there's a pretty good consensus. So from a conceptual standpoint, I can definitely see where giving up that control makes it feel less secure. Not having your hands on the wheel of a car, you don't feel comfortable driving that car. And I get that. But try to think of it from this way. What if you had to build your own car to drive? Would you rather Toyota build your car, or you say, you know what, no, I'm in control. I'm going to build my car. I'm going to cast all the parts myself. I'm going to make the glass. I'm going to do all... No, that sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, when you start looking at it from this way. So the perspective I look at it from is that AWS or these cloud services, they're just car manufacturers in a sense. They built a car for you. Obviously, how you drive, how you use that car, what you do with that car, all affects your safety, all affects your security. But at the end of the day, I would much rather trust Toyota build that car than me.
Yeah, and I mean, it opens up, because obviously there's, when pros and cons, at least in college I was learning, is, you save money hosting on-premise sometimes. Well, I mean, that opens up, I guess, a lot of administrative work.
It does, yeah.
And development and, things like vulnerability scans, patching and all that brings off of you. I think that'll be curious for the future of cloud too, especially as these type of things get more and more efficient and scalable and probably cheaper to do cloud, that it might become a better option for more, if not most companies.
Yeah. What's really interesting about that, and I know we probably don't have a ton of time, what's really interesting about what you're talking about the scale and getting cheaper, we've actually sort of already reached the crest or the peak of that, and it's almost going the other way now, which is why the conversation about on-prem is starting to become a little more pervasive than it was. So cloud expenses have actually started to rise in about the past 5 or so years, maybe 5, 10. And it's gotten a lot of consumers, a lot of companies wary of those bills when they realize, like, hey, we're a bit at the mercy of these companies. While I still agree that cloud infrastructure is absolutely more cost effective in the long run for the vast majority of people, it's undoubtedly something that people have their eye on pretty heavily right now, when those costs start to rise. Because we are seeing it, and the conversation is starting to become a little more important.
Gotcha. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for companies going forward that might be making the decision whether or not they want to go with cloud or on-prem, and if just thinking from a security perspective,
Sure.
What do you think would be the factors that you think would be most influential into you should go one way or another? Like if they have a dedicated security team, do you think it might be easier at that point to handle things in-house going forward?
So I think easier is an interesting word to use. I couldn't imagine a world, or I couldn't imagine a company where it's easier to manage your own large infrastructure, like something that's really important, needs high availability. Easier, I don't think, is ever going to be. I think on-prem is in the dust now when it comes to easier. Cloud has that in spades. Mm-hmm. When it comes to maybe cost effectiveness or, again, security concerns, there's obviously cases for things like government work, highly sensitive information, FedRAMP, things like that. I think in this day and age, it's still, or at least in today, it's still a little bit hard to see why you would choose to deploy a large-scale network on-prem. I could see use cases for very, very small, very closely guarded, but very, very important private software or pieces being deployed on-prem. There's plenty of use cases for that, absolutely. But if we're talking about some sort of actual infrastructure, like a hosted application, something that clients and customers are going to be relying on day in and day out, thousands of people are using, I couldn't imagine a good reason for a move to on-prem out of the cloud, at least today.
Makes sense. All right, well, I think that'll be a pretty interesting thought as we look into the next 5-10 years here, and who knows, maybe the conversation will turn around and
it absolutely
become
could.
the cool new thing to host on-prem again.
Who knows?
In the meantime, though, I think that just about covers most of the questions I had for cloud security. And thank you for meeting with me here today. If
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
listening along and you have any questions that you might want answered, feel free to shoot us an email. We'd be happy to assess this in some future podcasts or even just get back to you and let you know our thoughts.